All right, hello. Nice to see everybody. I'm going to talk about restorative justice, but I want to give you a story that goes beyond the data. So why are we talking about this? Suspensions remain one of the most common consequences for students having problem behaviors. And in particular, African American students and other students of color are suspended at rates that are far greater than their white classmates. So some data. A school district, you can see the enrollment of African American students and the suspension rate, and the enrollment of white students and the suspension rate. When we go into individual schools, it can look more alarming. African American students and suspension, white students and suspensions. So the other interesting piece is when we further disaggregate the data, we find the real discrepancies come when the reason for suspension is something that's more difficult to define, like defiance and disruptive behavior. And there's the least discrepancy for things like fighting and truancy. So there exists a racial achievement gap and a suspension gap. And we hear about the school to prison pipeline, and educators and others concerned want to know what to do. So over the past decade, there's been a shift from the zero tolerance policies, and in its place, we're hearing more about restorative practices as a solution to decrease suspensions. But we see that we need to discuss it at a different level because of our history with discrimination and low expectations for students. So let's talk about this need for change and how it's often characterized in the literature. Duke talks about first order problems as things that deal with deviations from the norm, and that they're generally solved without altering any fundamental structure for the system. But schools have reached an impasse. We keep dealing with misbehavior in the same way and getting the same results. So it's for these reasons that I worked to create a restorative school in North Minneapolis. We succeeded in taking a K-8 school from around 700 suspensions to 125. But the reason for this drop is the story that needs to be told because it keeps getting misconstrued. Data only tells part of the story. And it doesn't usually tell the part where we affect real change. So in this story, the drop in suspensions isn't a result of we just stopped suspending students, we kept them in school, we did something else. It's a different story, and one I'd like to tell you now. I invite you to read this quote. And think about those reasons for suspension of being defiant and disruptive behaviors. So the story under the data starts with the training. And when we started training the staff, we didn't give them strategies of what you're supposed to do with children. We began with how to be. So our time together was spent learning in circle for a week back. The week before school, typically called workshop week. We started by sharing our values. We started by listening to one another about why someone decided to come into teaching or social work or education in the first place. We just listened. And teachers said, wow, we've worked together for 7 years and I had no idea that your son was the same age as mine, and now they're both going to college this year? Teachers said, this was the best workshop week back I've ever experienced. I feel ready to start teaching on Monday because I feel relaxed and calm instead of rushed. And one associate educator who had a reputation of never smiling was grinning on this last day of the workshop and looked at the trainer and said, what did you do to me? By learning to be with each other, we were better equipped than to be with our students. We listened to our students, and we gave them an opportunity to listen to one another. Teachers made time every day to have circles, and when this happened, suspensions decreased. Students said, "This school is so much better this year, there aren't any fights in the halls." I like it better this year. For the first time, I know the names of the kids in my math class. The school also had 2 level 4 self-contained EBD classrooms. Those students also participated in Circle, and a student in that class said, "Now when I feel angry, I don't have to have a fight. We can have a circle." I think what's important to consider is that it was rather basic. People knew each other's names. They knew their story. To think that students were sitting in the middle school portion where they switch classes and not know someone's name is simple, but it happens all the time. So there's a story of, it's a K-8 school, and it was 3 or 4 days before the last day of school, and the 5th grade girls were going to have a big fight. It was going to happen after the last day of school. It was going to happen at the park across the street, and they were building it up. So one of the administrators said the solution was, we'll just suspend them the rest of the year. They don't have to come back. It's a common thing. We just don't want to talk about it, so we'll let it go away. But there was another administrator who said, "Oh no, let's have a circle and see what this is about." So there was a circle of all the 5th grade girls, all their parents. There was one parent who was working who couldn't come, so there was a phone on speaker, and when the talking pace came to her, she could participate. And what we learned was that these girls were afraid. They had been together in K-5, or because it was a transitional school, they've just really gotten close that year, maybe a few years. But 6th grade meant going to another area of the building where they were going to change classes, and it was a middle school that, though it was a K-8, it was a feeder middle school. So it was going to be a change. And they were worried, and they were worried about their friendship. So the circle unveiled those concerns and worries, and the children got to express their fears to one another and to their parents. And so the after story is there wasn't a fight. They finished the school year. They got to have the picnic instead of the fight at the park. And they stayed close in middle school. They supported each other through high school. They all went to college and supported each other through college, and they are still there with one another. So let's talk about what the training is not. It's not, "Oh, our school's doing that, we hired a facilitator." We now have a restorative justice room we send the kids to. Or someone came to an hour and talked to us about the circle. So transformational change is needed. We still have barriers of racism and lack of having equally high expectations for all students. So we need to transform larger society, but what are the implications then for those of us who work in schools of education? Schools are starting to recognize the need for change. And so we need to make sure we send our teacher candidates into schools prepared for these changes. There are no shortcuts. When it comes to building relationships, when it comes to decreasing suspensions, when it comes to creating schools that are restorative, not punitive, that are healing and not harmful, we can't wait, and our students can't wait. But it takes time, and it's worth the investment.